absolutely delighted to be here to discuss the most foundational aspect of indispensable power, the advantage that intelligence provides. Now, Gwen did a great job talking about defining space, so I'm going to define intelligence for me. Intelligence is the ability to know the truth, see beyond the horizon, and allow leaders to act before events dictate. It is as old a mission as we have, and it is incredibly relevant now. Now, Senator McCain, he was a great friend of intelligence. But he was not an easy friend. He understood fundamentally the trust that the American people place in institutions to whom they give great privilege. And he insisted we keep that trust. And he demonstrated when he questioned our activities to make sure they were aligned with our interests. And he did that when he questioned our programs to make sure they were mindful of the taxpayers' dollars. I'm pretty confident that he would enjoy the conversation we're going to have today. So I think we're in the latest epoch of national security threats, from Cold War to proliferating arms, to terrorism being the dominant threat, to now great power competition with the challenges of the digitally connected world. So what we're going to do today on this panel, this is an amazing panel, we're going to try and talk about the global security situation, talk about the moment that we find ourselves in of technological ubiquity and data abundance, and then we're going to spin into openness and trust and transparency, innovation, and mostly the kind of partnerships you need in order for success to provide, for the intelligence to provide the success that it always has. I have a great panel. Ma'am, Director Dixon, I'm going to turn it over to you to start us off. Give us a bit of a romp around the world in terms of kind of top global security threats.
So first, let me say it's wonderful to be here at the Sedona Forum, my first time, and it is wonderful to be here on this panel with both representatives as well as Sue. Having worked for Sue twice, the one thing that I know for sure is that she doesn't ask a question she already doesn't know the answer to, so thank you for humoring us here. But it really is great to be with both Representative Boyle and Representative Crow, and the fact that Congress is such a great partner to the intelligence community, your customers, but you have a really important role in oversight, which gets to that trust thing that Sue just mentioned. So I brought a couple notes because I didn't want to forget what I wanted to say to romp around the world in a short time. So we'll start with China. You never know where you're going to start with them or end with them. We'll start with them. Certainly have a desire to be the regional power, want to be a global power on the world stage, have a very different view of democracy than what we have here, with the idea of freedoms, the idea of having the people have a voice, not of interest to them, want to protect the regime. They want to decrease their dependency on the rest of the world, whether that's raw materials, microelectronics, but they want to increase the world's dependency on them, which gives them some leverage diplomatically. They are a geopolitical challenge to us in the diplomatic, military, technology, and economic space. And that's even before you start talking about their goals of reunifying with Taiwan. I'm going to leave that one there. Russia, 14 months into this unjustified, illegal invasion of Ukraine. Russia's certainly learning some interesting lessons about it. We see them growing in their relationship with China and others who are willing to sell them lethal arms. We see them out there trying to make sure that they can evade the sanctions that have been put on them by many, many countries. They still have very capable technology. We are continuing to watch that both in the military sphere and the space sphere, but it is challenged because of the sanctions that have been put on recently. North Korea. Still have the goals to enhance conventional and nuclear capabilities. They see them as a guarantor of the regime stability, of their role in the world. They have a very sophisticated cyber program, and they use that also to supplement how they can actually fund their capabilities. Iran, committed to eroding our influence around the Middle East. They certainly seek to be the premier power in the region, but doing so in very destabilizing ways. They use surrogates to carry out their intent in many countries, a lot of which are going against US interests. And while they do still have an interest in nuclear activities and talk a lot more about enrichment, We don't quite see the same threat with respect to the actual development of a weapons system. And then terrorism, you mentioned it, remains a threat. And even though we see it's localized in a number of countries, even though we see a less capable ability to hurt us here in the homeland, the intent and desire has not gone away from some of the different organizations. And the last thing I'll mention is the other things out there that have national security implications, whether it's climate change, whether it is global health security, transnational organized crime, both the trafficking X part of it as well as the narcotics part of it. All of those are continuing to have an increase in, they're frankly increasing the other things, they're exacerbating other issues around the world, exacerbating migration, exacerbating food insecurity. So that's sort of a bit of a romp, not all inclusive, but those are the things that kind of keep us up.
I love the last point. You know, strife and disenfranchisement are destabilizing. Destabilization leads to threats, and so I love that you added that. So let me pick up with you on Ukraine. It is, I think, our first information war. But I think it's also a bit of a microcosm where we can look at modern intelligence in a recent conflict. So can you talk a little bit about lessons learned from Ukraine in an intelligence lens?
Yes, and it's interesting. I think there's a lot of lessons we're learning, and because the war's not over, we will continue to learn those lessons. Every country that's paying attention is learning lessons, but we're not always all necessarily learning the same lessons. So first lesson would be the importance of being able to share information with allies and partners, and then frankly being able to share information with the world, which got us in front of disinformation, false flag operations that were going to be used, potentially used, to help justify this illegal invasion. The need to be able to downgrade information as you go along and have an apparatus that can do that quickly while still protecting sources and methods, to be able to get the information to those individuals on the ground who can actually do something with it. And finally, the alliances piece of it is really huge. Being able to not only see the strength of partnerships like NATO, but other partnerships as well, and many countries around the world taking a stand on what they saw as a sovereign country being attacked by another country.
Great. Representative Crow, great to have you here. I'm delighted to share a stage with you. Now, you're a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. How about if you give us your perspective on Ukraine, maybe from a humanitarian lens?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here, Sue, and Dr. Dixon and Brendan. Always good to share a stage with you. You know, I just wanted to dovetail on something that Dr. Dixon just talked about and kind of the evolution of the intelligence community, because a lot of the discussion so far in the forum, and certainly this morning, has been focusing on the use of intelligence and the development of alliances through the kind of hard national security military lens. I think the opportunity before us right now is a little bit different opportunity, and that is to evolve the intelligence community and you know, the IC writ large into an organization that can not just assess information like it historically has and provide information directly to the executive branch and for our generals and for those who are charged with our immediate national security, but how can we evolve the IC to take on a larger role to drive longer-term policy discussions and have smarter policy? And the key to that, in my view, is open source intelligence. Right? We are very good at collecting information about orders of battle, about military capabilities, signals intelligence, and distilling that and assessing that. What we are less good at is looking at open source information about the impact of the climate crisis, the impact of weakened governance, corruption, freedom of press, and incorporating that into our assessments to look more broadly about our policies and coordinate diplomatic, humanitarian, economic, and military aid. And Ukraine, I think, is the example of that. Right? We did a great job of predicting what Russia was going to do, but now the next step is how are we going to look 5-10 years out for Ukraine, and how are we going to project into a more stable and secure Europe that's going to require not just the military lens, but coordination of all those other tools.
For sure. I think what's interesting about your comment is with the intelligence community having a demand to share differently, there's also a moment where the private sector has to bear more responsibility for their decisions in a national security. So I think what you've opened up is we are entering a new era of not only partnership, but shared responsibility and feeling shared weight. The decisions that are being made in lots of sectors are affecting that. Representative Boyle, it's great to see you. Glad to be here. How about if you leap into the fray? Give us a perspective. Leap into this fray.
Yeah, so I also, like Jason, I serve in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I've been in the organization the last 6 years and lead one of the committees there. And I was thinking of that when you were speaking with respect to intelligence, because just by happenstance, our annual meeting in Brussels was in February, about 1 year and 3 months ago. The Sunday through Wednesday of the week of the invasion. The invasion ultimately took place late Wednesday night into Thursday morning. When we gathered for our opening dinner that Sunday evening, the vast majority of my parliamentary colleagues, these are folks who serve in their, well, I was about to say 30, then it would have been 29 other respective NATO countries, the Bundestag, the British Parliament, et cetera. About 70% of them did not believe the US intelligence. They just could not bring themselves, whether it was Iraq war overhang, whether it was this sometimes European perception about Americans and a willingness when it comes to engage militarily, a perception that I find frustrating and inaccurate, but nonetheless is sometimes there, particularly, candidly, on the left of center members. And I say that as a Democrat in an American context. Whatever it was, a solid 70% of them. And since that time, I've surveyed casually some of my other members of Congress who were there at that dinner, and they had the same approximation, both there as well as the opening session the following morning. So the fact that we were just within days of the invasion and so many of our European friends and partners didn't believe it was a challenge, and yet, then when the shock of the invasion happened in the middle part of that week, boy, did it help in terms of coalition building. Because the fact that we had made the kind of counterintuitive decision to release to the world our intelligence in advance, it made it impossible for Vladimir Putin to launch a false flag operation. I think that was, so we look back in terms of our ability to lead this coalition, that was a critical moment.
I love that. Stacey?
Can we say something about the piece that you mentioned with companies and others making decisions and now being part of even the policy community can make its own decisions as to what's going to happen, but when sanctions were put on many companies, Russian companies, many multinational organizations made their own decisions that had a huge effect on Putin's ability and Russia's ability to kind of continue in the world. And it's something that when we're thinking about whole of government, whole of nation, whole of alliance, it's a whole different different group that we have to start factoring in a different way. That I think this conflict has made that more so than any other conflict that we've seen.
Yeah, and I love that you bring it up because I think that looming potential conflict with China will test that even further because of our economic entanglement. So I love that you bring it up because I think it's something that we really need to think about now, how we're going to share, how we're going to participate.
Well, private industry is also driving most of our really deep debates within the IC, right? Whether it's on quantum, most of the development in AI is being done in private industry. We've had the commercial spyware issues, tools that traditionally were the domain of just state actors are now fairly universally available on the market by private companies, and now we're having to respond to that instead of proactively creating those technologies and governing them and creating them within a regulatory framework. So certainly the development of these technologies that are relevant to our national security is moving much faster than our policy responses at this point, and it's destabilizing.
Yeah. Yes, sir?
I just want to take a step back because we're having this conversation in a larger context in which there is a greater skepticism among the American public when it comes to the role of private industry in these matters. So that, frankly, as policymakers, makes our jobs even all the more challenging.
And we'll, I was thinking about the conversation that was held just before us, listening to Gwen talk about it. And, you know, one of the things that's so awesome about America is competition and openness and this energy that creates so much. But now we see the responsibility aspect of it, so I think that's what's going to test that. Okay, this conversation makes me have to go to cyber. Ukraine certainly, but cyber is really increasingly the means by which every aspect of adversary and competitor intent is being affected. And it's vexing because it doesn't obey the same physical boundaries or the rules that we have established. So for all of you, as you looked at the Ukraine conflict, how do you see cyber playing out, and what lessons of preparedness do you think we learn? It's a grab bag.
Well, I think the first is we have to change the manner in which we view our investments for cyber defense. I mean, we still have this 20th century focus for how we make investments in what I think are largely legacy systems, right? We invest in these large defense systems, and we underinvest in recognizing that, you know, our front lines are now every computer terminal, every USB plug. That is the modern front line. And we're not remotely ready to deal with that, right? We have CISA, we have some structures within the U.S. government that try to look at this holistically and tie it all together. But I'll use the example of when SolarWinds happened. So when the SolarWinds hack was discovered, the Department of Defense Information Network, the DoDIN, actually isn't one network. It's actually 74 different networks. And you had managers of all those different networks literally picking up the phone and calling other network administrators within the Pentagon asking whether they used SolarWinds, because they didn't know, and nobody had a common picture. And we actually wouldn't have even discovered that SolarWinds breach had it not been for a private company that had unique access by contract to several different government agencies across the enterprise that looked and was able to see holistically that there were anomalies that ran across the enterprise and that it didn't quite add up. Nobody within the federal government had the ability to actually do that. So that's a problem, and it hasn't been fixed yet.
So, ma'am, you want to pick up on that and talk about how you think the IC is doing in terms of both understanding and sharing?
So yes, we have learned a lot of lessons since then and are working towards the fixing. I think with respect to the understanding side, if you look at some of the structures that have been created, so our Counter-Threat Intelligence Integration Center existed before but has been reinvigorated to figure out how to better partner with industry who does have a lot of the knowledge and a lot of the capabilities. How do we also have more analytic exchanges with those who are seeing things maybe different from a different perspective? The National Cybersecurity Strategy also encourages those public-private partnerships and that back and forth of information. So that is getting better on the understanding side. We're also figuring out how to leverage parts of government that are not in the intelligence community to include the law enforcement side of FBI and some of the information that they collect, which can tremendously help some of our intelligence products. How do you better collaborate in places where there had been more of a divide beforehand? On the communication side, we definitely can still do better. We have a number of places where companies have to go in, whether they're in the defense industrial base or whether they're not, whether they're working with government or whether they're not. Having one place where people can go to kind of report an issue, that's a concern that I've heard people pose before. It's like, well, I have to call this organization, and then I have to call this one as well. How do we make it easier for those who want to report things to do that and do so in a way that they know it's going to be the information will be protected?
I would say until the shock of seeing tanks rolling into Ukraine a year and 3 months ago, the conversation that most came up, particularly at NATO meetings, was about cyber. And there's a real, fairly or not, there is a real feeling among our allies, particularly the farther east you go, such as in the Baltics, that we are not doing enough in the alliance to help them with their cyber defenses. I remember I have a large Ukrainian-American diaspora in the Philadelphia area, so I've been working on Ukrainian issues going back to when I was first elected a decade ago. And one of the first provisions that we were able to get through some Foreign Affairs Committee at the time was a provision specifically to bolster cybersecurity in Ukraine. Because if we look back now, whether it was Georgia 2008, all the cyber attacks against Ukraine and other Eastern European countries beginning in the last decade, boy, there was the playbook just starting to be rolled out by Putin. and everything that we've had to live with for the last now more than a decade began from '08 on.
And I love that you brought that up, because I think prior to onset of hostilities in Ukraine, there was just a lot of concern, because we know that Russia has such tremendous cyber capabilities that what we would see is actions over here, massive, because we know they have potential. And because those didn't manifest, I worry that people thought that it wasn't really going on. But if you were in Europe, if you were in Ukraine, it was a massively aggressive.
The French presidential election.
Yes.
Not that long
So
ago.
don't be confused because it didn't happen here, that it isn't significant.
And that we don't need to prepare for.
And that we don't need to prepare for it and think about it. And I love that you talk about sharing. The other thing I will just say is where I think that you and Director Haynes have done a great job is in sharing intent. So much early in days, we shared details of specific threats we knew, but we held on to the holy grail of intent. And intent is really when you share that, you allow people to know how they should protect themselves. So give you credit. All right, it's a technical world. Every technology is available to everything. Everything is go through that. And again, we listened to Gwen talk about it. I'll start with you, Stacey. Talk to me about this moment in intelligence in terms of both the concerns you have about the globalization of technology, because it's really quite remarkable, and also kind of how the intelligence community is thinking about technology, helping it create the kind of advantage that Representative Crow talked about.
And so there's three ways that we're looking at it. One is literally, what is it? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? How are others around the world thinking about using it? And then how do we use it to help better our mission? I'm excited about technology. As an engineer, I have to say that, number one. It is. And I also like the dialogue that we're having, recognizing that especially in the artificial intelligence front, recognizing that things are moving very quickly and tools and capabilities are being used in ways that we did not quite imagine they'd be used as quickly. Research has been going on for a long time for some of these models that are out there now, but the adoption by the public, the use by the public, and how people might think about using it for nefarious purposes, that is something that we have to watch out for. But I also think that we're trying to figure out, how do you put bounds on things that can be threats without stymieing the opportunity that also exists there? And so between the policymaker conversations and us and the nonprofits out there who are also thinking about these things, there's a lot of really good thought going into it that I'm seeing right now. Are not thinking about the unintended consequences of who gets them and what they start doing with them. Smart cities are great in the sense that you can do a lot of understanding and providing services for your population. They can also be used for digital oppression. And a lot of people want to use them for that purpose. So how do we start thinking about the technologies for both the good they can do and the bad they can do? Protect privacy and civil liberties like we do, that goes with our values, but also recognize that others will be using them in a different way.
Congress is right in the middle of this conversation, and part of the conversation is this tension between protecting advantage and not closing down innovation. So how are you all seeing this kind of technological moment play out in Congress?
Well, there's no doubt that we're in a technological race, and the victor of that race will be determined by the talent, the people that we're able to recruit and have focused on these technological challenges, whether it's AI, quantum, cyber, et cetera. So the good news is most innovation still happens within the United States, and we have incredible talent here. We have an incredible private industry here, and we still have a higher education system and research ecosystem that's the envy of the world. The bad news is many of those folks don't want to go to work in government. They want to go to work in private industry. So what that necessitates is we have to have a different relationship between government and private industry now. And OD&I is actually doing remarkable things. You just launched the new pilot program that actually creates an exchange program between the IC and private industry, with the recognition that long gone are the days when someone will go to work for the government and then they'll retire 30 years later with a pension. That just doesn't happen, or rarely happens. people understand that career ladders are more like career mosaics now, and people will go spend 2 or 3 years in private industry, pick up incredible talent and experience, and then rotate back to CIA or NSA. And then they'll do that throughout their entire career. So our security clearance system is not designed to accommodate that. So that's where security clearance reform comes in. But also innovative programs like this pilot project to allow that to happen and more back and forth is actually going to be key to winning this technological race.
Yeah.
We're still fortunate that the best and the brightest in the world want to come here.
Want to come.
It's a hell of an advantage, especially as we move to AI being a bigger piece of this. Now, the fact that we make it so difficult for them to come here, or we make it so they can come here, get a great education, and then make it challenging for them to stay here, is probably not in our best interest. So while I don't want to sidetrack the debate onto a different topic, it is a related one that if we're going to have the best and the brightest here, that we need this, and we're training them, probably a good idea to make it easier to keep them.
Yeah, it's.
Can I say one more thing on tech?
You may.
And it goes to the public-private talent exchange program, but also just the ways that we're thinking about it. Recognizing that not everyone wants to be in government, and frankly, we don't want all the talent in government because it's great where it is, in academia, in parts of industry, but how do we allow ourselves to be able to avail ourselves of that expertise in a way that is not complicated and that we can do really quickly to get the kind of insights that we need. And so we're working through that. We've had some great interactions with industry leaders on a number of emerging tech topics to get their thoughts on what we should be thinking as we come up with our IC-wide strategies.
If our goal is to not have all of the talent in government, I think the public would say we've succeeded.
Agreed.
And I would say that talent in government is really important as well.
Yes, that's true.
So I think this knows, I will love to see how this plays out. I do think it's the moment of the day where we have to balance having something worthy of protecting and then protecting, because those two tensions, those can have counterbalance tensions. All right, here's where Senator McCain would have loved this question. Oversight is so important to intelligence, in part because the intelligence community is so intentional. It intends to keep America safe for democracy. It intends to do the hard things incredibly well. So let's talk about oversight a bit and what the role is now. How do you see it?
Well, one thing that's unique is that the United States has the strongest intelligence oversight committees in the world, right? HPSCI on the House side, SISI on the Senate side. There's no other country that has committees like that are as empowered, that have budgeting authority, not just overarching budgeting authority, but line item budgeting authority, and the ability to engage with our intelligence community in the way that we do. And the relationship is obviously very different. I've sat on this Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, Small Business Committee. The relationship between the Intel Committee and the IC is really phenomenal, actually. The amount of time that I've spent with Dr. Dixon and Director Haynes and Director Burns developing those relationships, it's a very collaborative one. It's a very bipartisan committee. But I think what's important is understanding our different roles, right? Our roles are not to be experts in quantum or AI, but rather that connective tissue with the American people. And there's no greater illustration of that right now than the debate about FISA 702, right? Where you have FISA 702 is our surveillance program that allows us to basically conduct surveillance through commercial internet providers and others on key targets. And that program, which was derived after 9/11, has gone through a couple of different iterations. There's been some issues of misuse of that authority, but really right now we're having a national conversation about what is the nature of surveillance in the 21st century and how do we balance surveillance with privacy concerns, with civil liberties. To what extent do we allow warrantless surveillance to occur, even of non-U.S. citizens outside of the United States? And how do we balance that against very real national security concerns? Because that program undoubtedly, I know, has thwarted and continues to thwart on a regular basis attacks against the homeland and against U.S. citizens and interests overseas. So we're having that conversation publicly, and that's one that's driven by the representatives of the people primarily through these oversight committees.
You know, if we look back, say, since the beginning of the Cold War, and we look at Congress, which something I recall Senator McCain would say a lot, a reminder that the first article of the Constitution is not the executive branch, it's the legislative branch. Well, if we look in the Cold War context in the 50s and the 60s, Congress was probably overly lax when it came to the intelligence community. Then a number of scandals were revealed in the 1970s. You had the church hearings. And then the pendulum probably swung too far in the other direction, where there was hostility toward the IC and a number of restrictions were put into place. From 9/11 on, though, I do feel like we are now somewhere close to getting that pendulum where it should be, in the middle, not either overly lax or too stringent. I mean, if you had said, and I understand there are those on the far left and the far right who have their own objections to 702, but that leaves a very broad 80% or so who are largely supportive. And if you had said in the afternoon of September 11th, 2001, that 2 decades later, we would not have a major attack on the homeland, very few people would have believed it that afternoon, and absolutely everyone would have been quite happy to learn that, in fact, the next 20 years would play out that way. And our IC is a big reason why.
It's so nice that I don't have to be the one actually asking and defending at the moment, and that we've got members of Congress who understand the issues and are willing to work with our colleagues who may not be on the same page. We're trying to do our part by declassifying as much information as we can so there can be a broader conversation, so constituencies can also be comfortable with what it is and, frankly, what it's not. I think there's a lot of also myth-breaking about some of it, but yes, compliance issues exist. We've done a lot to get better, and I think we're starting to figure out how to tell that message better. I hope we are anyway.
Let's talk about the other aspect of oversight, which is that which you allow through budget.
Yeah.
And what I know is during disrupted times, there are a lot of demands on budget because you're trying to change. And I love when you talk about 9/11, because on 9/11 or on 9/12, if you were walking in Washington, you didn't think you would ever again look up in the sky without being afraid that it was going to fall on us. And yet 20 years we found a way. We're going to have to find our way through this moment as well, but it isn't going to come cheap. So how do you think intelligence is going to fare in the budget process?
Actually, just to follow up on that anecdote, I still remember walking around Old Town Alexandria about 2 weeks after 9/11, and every time there was a plane in the sky, you absolutely took notice, and so did everyone else. So we do well to remember that actually that wasn't that long ago. In terms of the budget process, as ranking member of the Budget Committee, I, up until this point, have been very happy not to have to talk about the debt ceiling. We will have independently, obviously between now and September 30th, we need to arrive at the budget for the next fiscal year. I'm a pragmatist. There is a narrowly Republican-controlled House, a narrowly Democratic-controlled Senate, and Democrat in the White House. The idea that this budget is going to be a radical departure one way or the other, that it's not going to be somewhere really close between the 40-yard lines, I would find that hard to believe. So I would expect that specifically in terms of IC, I would be shocked if there was some sort of significant change next year and the year beyond compared to the most recent years.
So then, ma'am, the change will be you're going to have to figure out with that same top line how you take the programs that have served us so well and make us serve this moment, but I have confidence in you. So, so many things I want to talk about. Let's talk about partnership. And in part because of this world we've all described that is connected, that is data abundant, I started when intelligence, we were hunters. We had to go find the data, and the data itself was tremendous advantage. Now the world knows everything. And that changes the nature of partnership. It changes how fast everything moves, and consequently, it changes how we partner and who we partner. So how about we'll have a conversation, but I'll give you first word here. How do you think about partnership that is so central to foreign policy being affected in this really quite different world?
I think it's interesting that not only are we seeing the strength in partnerships like NATO, for example, right? Historic ones, but some more formal and informal partnerships in different groupings of countries in different parts of the world, and the importance of having regional leadership that's willing to take on issues that are unique to a particular place. How do we, as in the intelligence community, in all of our various countries, work together behind the scenes to make sure that all of our policymakers have the information they need is something that we're thinking about a lot. So whether it is partnerships with other countries, knowing that no conflict is going to be an individual country going in, probably ever again, to partnerships with industry, partnerships with academia, partnerships across governments, it will just continue to evolve going forward. That's sort of how I see it, and that's how that's sort of the guidance we've been given, but it's also the strength that we've seen that we just want to continue to sort of underpin with, okay, how does intelligence play into not only the intelligence partnerships, but the other partnerships that also have to exist that will rely on the information that we provide.
Are you seeing any difference, even in our most traditional partnerships? So when the world became digitally connected, I would argue that the forces moved from solely political military to being economic relationships. And that's a different kind of partnership. So are you seeing much of a change in terms of how we even need to execute our partnership with our most traditional partners? And Stacey, ma'am, you can take this, or any of the
I'll take the piece of it that is ours. There's certainly a higher demand signal for questions in the economic sphere, economic threat finance, all of those things that we're having to answer a lot more questions, which is how we're having to rely on a lot more expertise outside of government until we can kind of bring more into.
Well, like everything else that's undergoing massive upheaval and change right now, pretty much in every context, I would include partnerships in that. I think the nature of our partnerships have to change and evolve, and we have to look at it through a very different lens. And I think one of the lessons of the 20th century, if you look at our foreign policy successes and failures in the 20th century, is changing our focus to one solely based on state-to-state partnerships and engaging more with people within other countries, right? Because governments change, politics shift, but relationships with people, and if you have a people-centered foreign policy engagement, that's enduring. And not only is it enduring, but it also helps promote the other things that are indicators of stability and success, whether it be economic inequality, good governance, free society. So we need to be more innovative in who it is we're engaging with, and not just focus on the governments, but look at civil society, look at press, look at some of the movements within particularly the Global South, which is an enormous opportunity for us. And there are folks who want to engage and are looking for us to engage. And if we engage differently through people within those countries, I think we'll have a lot more success, and that success will be more enduring.
Representative Boyle, I was thinking about you in this question when you answered about Ukraine and our European partners. Are you seeing the energy around their demand signal for partnership and changing at all, or do you think it's just continuing, as Representative Crow says, finding new modalities in order to provide that same foundational underpinning below the chop of policy?
Well, a few years ago, an unwise man once said, NATO is brain dead. I don't think anyone believes that anymore. And I think for those on either side of the Atlantic who might have been talking about moving away from the transatlantic alliance, boy, we now see the folly of that sort of a notion. Despite the fact I think I've heard the term pivot to Asia for the last 2 decades, the reality is the foundation of the security of the world still is the transatlantic alliance, and that's with the US leading it. And all the Ukraine war has done is put that onto center stage and even win over the skeptics of a few years ago to recognize it. In the years ahead, I think we will have an interesting conversation in terms of what we do with Ukraine and greater NATO partnership. Would this war have even happened had they been a NATO ally to begin with, as opposed to one of those countries with whom we're in partnership, but they're not formally part of an alliance? That kind of a question, as well as some other countries, will be for the years ahead. But for now, this is truly the golden moment for NATO and the transatlantic alliance, and certainly the most important since November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell.
Can I offer just a counter view? I mean, I agree with NATO, and I agree with the strength of NATO and the importance of NATO. I think we have to be very careful, though, at having transatlantic, NATO-centered view of things, because I think where a lot of the competition is going to occur, and I just talked about the global South and the emerging world, they view it very differently. Like they don't think the West was successful in addressing some of their deeper issues, whether it be debt issues, whether it be economic inequality issues, whether it's climate. They view our solutions as hypocritical at best in many cases. And they don't view Ukraine the same way that we view Ukraine. Let's not forget that nearly 50 countries abstained from the Ukraine vote in the UN that constitute over 1 billion population of the world. So yes, NATO has a huge role to play, but we have to expand the aperture here, and we have to understand that there is a history that we have not reckoned with regard to vast swaths of the world, Africa and Central and South America primarily, that have a very different frame and are looking for us to engage and don't necessarily buy in to the way that we've done it in the past.
And even traditional partners like Australia have a very different view of China, where they must attend to the competitive forces, not just adversarial. So I think you're exactly right. All right, we have 3 minutes and 30 seconds left. I asked for 3 days for this panel. They said no. So best and final from each one of you. Representative Boyle, you first. What did we miss that you really wanted to talk about? And what do you see in the offing that you want this audience to be aware of?
Well, you missed nothing. You did a great job as moderator, so certainly no complaints here. I would say moving forward, however, I'm reminded Mark Twain once said, predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. So I will keep that in mind and be a little humble and just say that attempting to have a conversation about the future of intelligence in a world in which the technology is moving so quickly, there are just a lot of known unknowns out there, and recognizing that and being open to that and not taking a closed view that then you end up missing a lot of these variables. We don't want to go down one path and then wake up 4 or 5 years later and realize we've committed ourselves to the Betamax in a VHS world, to use a very 1980s reference.
Sage words indeed. Representative Crow.
I think we have to have a mindset shift in the way we view our competition and our challenges. We cannot lead or act from a position of fear and anxiety, and so often we allow fear and anxieties and our uncertainties drive our mindset and our response to things. I think we need to have some confidence. And I'm not calling for complacency, and I'm not calling for arrogance, but I think we have to have confidence in our strengths. We have to have confidence in some of our competitive advantages, and people will see that and people will respond to that, and I think we'll end up with better, smarter policy than if we are fear and responsive based. China obviously poses a lot of challenges, but they're not 10 feet tall either. Right? They have no shortage of their own crises and challenges as well. We have our challenges. Everybody does. But I'm calling for a little bit of self-confidence in the way that we address things.
Love that. Dr. Dixon.
So if you think about the title of the conference, America, the Indispensable Power, how did we get there? Through trust and partnerships. I want you to think about as many challenges as we have in our intelligence community, and frankly, there's a lot of critiques that we deserve. Intelligence services in democracies versus autocracies are very different.
Yeah.
In autocracies, they're there to protect the regime, to repress people, and basically to not allow that voice, those protests to happen. We live and work underneath rules and regulations that are aligned to the values of this country. So as challenged as we can be, this is sort of the foundation of what I want people to think about when they think of the intelligence community, because we do our work in apolitical ways. We do our work, coming to work every day, trying to make sure that we are taking into consideration privacy, civil liberties, and protections of the rights and privileges of the American people. And we need help to do that. We need the partnerships with industry, academia, whole of nation. And while not everyone's willing to work with us, there are many that are, and we are grateful for that partnership.
So in this moment of disruption where it seems that we should be daunted, in fact, you should be hopeful. And one of the reasons is because this is the kind of talent that works for the U.S. government. Thank you all very much.